Hello, hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Skeptics and Seekers Sunday Sermon. Let's jump right into the transcendental argument for God, aka TAG. I despise TAG. It might end up being number one on the list simply because I hate it so much, and I've never seen a presentation of TAG that didn't just get under my skin and piss me off. Um, I think Mac Attack has learned this about me because when I have the most heated arguments with him, it's usually when he's saying something that sounds like a tag or presup argument. So my and I've never listened to the argument or seen a version of the argument uh, made by someone who didn't seem like an asshole. Just someone who seems like a cocky, uh, thinks they know it all, smarmy asshole. And that might be. I mean, I may have so associated tag with asshole that I have unwittingly downgraded the argument simply because of how I feel about people who tend to use it. And yeah, I do lump uh, taggers and presuppers together. Venn diagram says there's almost a perfect crossover between the two. So we're not going to do a separate one on presuppositionalist because, yeah, what we say about tag is going to equally apply. I did choose this video because I did like the presentation of the young man who's doing it. I didn't catch his name, but that's okay. I seldom catch names. You can probably see the name or find the name. You can let me know. I thought he did an excellent job of the presentation of Tag. So good job, YouTuber. I thought that he made it very clear, very approachable, to the extent that it can be clear and approachable. So I've heard a lot of presentations of this. This is the one I chose. I thought this one was the best. Um, he still seems like a very smarmy, cocky, yeah, but that's just a seeming based on almost nothing. All right. I think part of it is to argue tag. You have to pretend to know more than you do. You have to be extremely confident about things that you shouldn't be extremely confident about. And so it makes talking to someone who's pushing tag very difficult because they're not listening to you. They're right. They know they're right. There's no other way besides their way of thinking about it. There are no other options, and that's just I think that's just baked into the argument. But that said, YouTuber, if you see this video and you feel ambushed, um, hit me up, skepticsandseekers.squarespace.com. Uh, and the email address, skepticsandseekers@gmail.com. We'll get you on the show. Let's talk about it. I can say that of all the people who I've heard talk tag, I think I'd rather talk to you than any of them because I think you've got a very clear picture of what it is and a very nice presentation. So good on you for that. And let's, yeah, I'll say some more things as we go.
What's up, guys, and welcome back to yet another episode of Chewing That Apologetics. I'm your host, Caden, the Trinitarian Trooper, and in today's video, we're actually going to be looking at my favorite argument for God, and also, in my opinion, the best argument for God, which is the transcendental argument for God.
Okay, so is it Caden? So I'll try to remember that, Caden. Um, so there are a couple of things I'm going to say. I pretty much think that tag has two, maybe three fatal flaws. We could do it in two, though. Um, And I want to give Caden some credit because he does go over major objections to tag. And so he's self aware enough to realize that there are people who do not agree with him. And he, I think, states the objections fairly well, but there are some cases where I think he doesn't really fully understand the depth of the objection because even though he talks about them, he doesn't actually dismiss them, doesn't really clear them in a way that makes it seem like he fully understands the objections. But still, I want to give you credit for that, Caden, as well. My two objections are going to be objections that you cover, and I still think my objections stand. So we'll see when we get there. Objection number one that I'm going to make is that it's a viciously circular argument. We'll talk about that here very shortly. And objection number two, it's the what I call mistaking not things for things. It's like the argument from numbers, the argument from morality, the argument from beauty. These are all category errors. Because in order for these ideas to get off the ground, you have to think of those ideas as things. All right. And the key is metaphysical, even though it's not said very often out loud. That's the underpinning of all of the things that aren't actually things argument. So in this case, he's going to talk about logic in universal truths. Well, you know what? Those aren't things. Those are descriptions of things. Logic is a description of relationships of things in reality, especially as it has to do with identity. The color blue, although we can describe that in physical terms, color itself, or let's take away color and do beauty. Beauty is not a thing. I think we can make a case that color actually is a thing. Beauty is not a thing. It's a description of a thing. There's no metaphysical object beauty, right? Numbers are not things. I don't know what it's going to take to get Christians to understand this. Numbers are not things. They are descriptions of things dealing with relationships of things within reality. So we can describe numerically things in reality. It's a language that we use to describe values of things and relationships. That's what numbers are. They're descriptions. They're not things. And the same thing with logic. It's a language that we use to describe certain aspects of reality. So we have a language that we can use with other people so that it is clear what we are talking about when we're making these descriptions. We call them logic. We didn't invent the ideas of logic. We invented the language to talk about them. We didn't invent the fact that 1 + 1 is 2. We invented the language that we have to talk about them. All right. So the key to understanding all of these is metaphysics. This is where Christians sneak in an idea that is the center of talking past each other, especially on something like the moral argument. Because Christians, when they hear moral, they are thinking about metaphysical objects, metaphysical things. Good is a metaphysical real thing. Evil is a metaphysical real thing. Atheists are not talking about metaphysical anythings. We're describing how we feel about things. But we're not actually describing things. And for the Christian, there is always this category of metaphysics. They might even call spiritual realities. And so already we're off to a bad start once you start talking about this and you don't expose the metaphysical presuppositions that are underlying all of it. When you do, you can begin to understand why Christians believe that their arguments stand, and why skeptics are sitting there saying, "You didn't even address the argument. What are you talking about?" We are talking about two different realities. One where not things are things, and one where not things are not things. So you need to establish metaphysical reality before you can even kind of have a conversation with an atheist Christian. And so maybe that's a subject to talk about at some point. But that is a fatal flaw in the transcendental argument for God. I'm going to talk about transcendental here in just a moment.
Yeah, let's get right into it.
Thanks for that, Katie.
Tag pretty much goes like this. Y is the necessary precondition for X, X, therefore Y. Let me kind of simplify that a little bit because it may sound a little confusing at first. Pretty much what this is saying is God is the necessary precondition for logic to even exist. Logic exists, therefore God exists.
Okay. God is the necessary precondition is a conclusion to an argument. It's a bad premise. So what I actually need to hear in this viciously circular argument, I need to hear the first premise you give as the conclusion of an argument. God's necessary, therefore God is the necessary precondition for logic. Because I need to know how you got there. How did you get there? What things led to the conclusion that God is a necessary precondition for logic? And we can't just start there. When you say logic exists, man, it's another thing that I feel like I could nitpick because we're getting into that metaphysical territory. And so I can easily say logic doesn't exist. Or I could say, what do you mean by exist? Because it sounds like you're making an argument for a thing that I would not call a thing and would not say exists. I would say it's a description of reality. Reality exists. Logic is a way that we describe certain aspects of it. But I'm not going to get that pedantic. Let's just accept logic exists. But you haven't said anything that gets me to God exists. You have simply said that God is a precondition to logic, and that is a completely unmoored, unhinged first proposition. We can't get past that. So, fails at proposition 1, could also fail at proposition 2.
Now, I specifically target logic, but you can also use other things. Like you can go for universal truths and morality. So you could say, well, God is a necessary precondition for universal truths to exist. Universal truths do exist, therefore God exists. But I specifically like to target logic.
Okay. And one other thing I'm going to target here that it's been a few days since I watched this. It's the name of the argument itself, which becomes just another presupposition that they don't even have to talk about. It's transcendental. So it assumes that something transcends or is higher, or goes beyond something else. Can we unpack that? They just assume. They just take all of their baggage that's nicely packed into this ball of assumptions and just start the argument from there. But hang on, transcending from what to what? What exactly is being transcended in the transcendental argument? Well, let me just give it to you in ways that Christians would rather not. They would like to keep it all vague. What they're saying is that humans, human persons, human minds, human ideas are not the highest point, and there's a higher point. The higher point is that which transcends the human. And for them, the only higher thing that transcends humans is God. So when you say transcendental argument for God, you're actually claiming God in the transcendental part. There's a whole argument embedded in transcend. And I think that if we're talking to a proper philosopher, we could engage a little bit more and maybe unpack a little bit better what you mean by transcend and what are all of um, the presuppositions that we're putting into transcend. Because if we pulled that all apart, I think that we have some problems there. But you see, once you accept the idea that something is transcending something, and you accept the idea unchallenged that God is a precondition for logic, there's no need for the syllogism anymore. I don't know why we're starting with a syllogism, because in order for the syllogism to work, you have to already accept the conclusion. So, right.
And so the question that I'll ask the atheists, if you guys have been watching the channel and have seen my debate against two atheists, one Frobro and another woman on TikTok, the question that I ask is, what is your epistemic justification for logic? I was just wondering what your basic epistemic foundation for the existence of logic was.
Okay, and before his guest answers, I'm going to answer, why do we need an epistemic foundation for anything? This is a trick question, the whole epistemic foundation thing, because no matter what you're talking about, the Christian will always regress it one more step. This is a trick. So if you're talking about physics, and you're looking at something in physics, and you can map out the cause and effect and the energy, where it comes from, where it goes, its various states. You can do all of that with precise clarity, and they would still say, but what's the epistemic foundation for that? Right? What's, the world, Earth, gravity, but what's holding up the world is kind of the equivalent to this epistemic foundation question. And so the one who is trying to make a cogent argument gets forced into a false dilemma of, well, either it's turtles all the way down or God. You see, and so whenever you hear epistemic foundation come out, you know kind of what you're dealing with. No one ever talks about an epistemic foundation for God, and I don't think that we're going to do that here, but and maybe again, this is something we can talk about in the comments, but yeah, I think there are very few occasions when a question of epistemic foundation is a good, legitimate question in apologetics. Right. What is your basic epistemic justification for the existence of logic? And so pretty much what I'm asking here is, how do you believe that logic exists? How does logic exist in your worldview? Now, this may sound like a pretty simple question, but this is actually such a struggle for the atheist to answer. And now you might hear some different answers from them, but they all fall short. I'm going to go over a couple that they might say, but first I actually want to go ahead and shut down something that you guys might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, Caden, that explanation you gave on tag, y is a necessary precondition for x, therefore y, that sounds very circular. Two things. The first thing is it is circular, right? But okay, I'm going to stop right there. So before you give Caden too many plaudits, and give him some for acknowledging that. This is actually a common talking point for people running tag and precept. You've seen it on the board with some of my conversations. This is built in to the argument. This is not epistemic humility. So don't mistake those things because they know it's circular. And so lots of people, in fact, all of them, if questioned hard enough and long enough, will admit that it's circular, but they have a response to that. And the response is, well, they admit that it's circular. They admit that there's presupposition, kind of the same thing here. And their response is "so's your old man," which is to say, at some level, all arguments are circular. All arguments are presuppositions. We have to presuppose something. So everybody is a presuppositionalist, and everybody uses circular arguments. So rather than to try to fix a logical fallacy, what they want to do is try to put everybody in the same boat and say, we all sink together. Sometimes, I will grant it, I think sometimes that is a reasonable argument to say that what you're saying is a fallacy is something that is just common to humanity. It couldn't be removed from humanity. So I'm not saying that argument is bad in and of itself. I'm saying it's bad as it applies to this, and when they never actually face the circularity of their argument or the presuppositionalness of their argument because they believe they can just dismiss it by saying, everybody does it.
In a way, like every worldview at the biggest level is circular, right? So every worldview at the biggest level is kind of circular. The question is it viciously circular? And the answer is no, right? So again, all we're saying is that God is the necessary precondition for logic to exist. We know that logic exists, therefore God exists because he's the only option for logic to exist.
This is a part of that unfounded certainty that I spoke of earlier. We know, and God is the only possibility. You hear these statements. I don't know why this is not a debate then. This is not even a discussion. It's just a textbook. You are narrating a textbook and saying this is how you have to think. Otherwise, you're not thinking at all. No, that's a choice in how you present an argument. One of the things I like about the way Dale presents arguments is he presents epistemic options and talks about some of the objections to the argument or other ways that you can think about the argument. Now, he still prefers his argument. I think he's much better about that sort of thing. But when you're running tag, you can leave no oxygen for the possibility of anything else being true.
And I know that he's the only option because any explanation, any attempt that you make in order to explain logic without God simply always falls short, right?
Okay. But you can't know. Let's say that you're right, Caden, and that every explanation falls short. That doesn't mean that God stands as the only explanation standing, because we haven't even established the existence of a God. Right? That's like me saying the only condition, necessary contingent fact that can support logic is the flying spaghetti monster. And since logic exists, the flying spaghetti monster exists. And we know that logic exists, and we know that the flying spaghetti monster exists because all other ways of trying to explain the foundation of logic fail. I mean, that's pretty much what you've said. And so You could talk to someone who does not believe in the Christian God, who believes in some other gods. Talk to Hindus. You get lots of candidates for that. So your declaration that God is the only answer to this opens the door to, about, I don't know, 10,000 or so other answers, making it false that God is the only answer to this. And those explanations of other gods I don't believe in are exactly as sound as your explanation, which is to say, not at all. Uh, I talk about this a lot when God becomes the only answer. How did God even get in the ballot box? I mean, we're trialing explanations usually with things that we can see in nature. Was it the Higgs boson? Was it a quark? Is it a force? Is it a particle? Uh, are there signs that other universes exist? There are lots of explanations for things that we see, and we put on the ballot box things that actually exist and have explanatory power. You know what scientists never put in the ballot box? Zeus. Zeus never goes in the ballot box as a possible explanation. Um, and so we never say, well, because all of the other explanations seem to fail in some way, I guess the answer is Zeus. Right. But, Caden, I'm sure that you can see that problem, and I would love to see how you respond to it because you seem like someone who, has tried to think about these things. You've just made a series of claims and you have done nothing to actually address the vicious circularity of the argument.
And you're always able to reduce it to an absurd. But real quick, I'm going to give some quick refutations that the atheists might try to make to this argument. And I'm going to tell you guys why they fall short and how exactly to go against them. The first refutation is it exists because it works. Yeah, I'm asking you how you think it exists.
So how I think that logic exists?
Yeah.
Metaphysically. What's in our heads?
But what is the cause of logic?
See, we've got an answer of metaphysically, and there is a pause because everybody has a little bit different idea of what the heck you're talking about metaphysically. I mean, then he moves to what's in our head. Okay, I endorse that move, but it's still not enough. What's in our head? Brains are in our heads. Well, brains are things. And I think that we have to go maybe a little bit deeper for this answer and talk about ideas that which brains produce and descriptions, which are things that we produce. So the question itself is kind of malformed. How does logic exist? Tell me how logic exists. And this is where you have to go to the more pedantic challenge that I made, which is, what do you mean by exist? Because it sounds like you've got two people cross-talking and with two different ideas of existence. So no matter what the caller says on the other line, whether it's adequate or not, it's never going to be adequate for Caden because he's talking about a different kind of exist.
Without logic, we wouldn't be talking right now.
Here we're talking about, in your debate, what is your epistemic foundation for the existence of logic?
It works, so we use it. It works without any, it works. If you think logically, if you act upon a logical way of finding little truths here and there to build up a larger picture, it works.
Right, and I just want to join Caden by saying it's an insufficient answer because they're talking about two different things. They are, because it works doesn't explain a metaphysical reality, because there are no metaphysical realities. So that's never going to satisfy the answer when you're looking for a metaphysical foundation to a physical thing, or a thing that is merely an idea, just an idea or description. Yeah, but what's the metaphysical reality undergirding that description? Well, there is none. And you can just kind of see that disconnect there. But atheists, I would suggest that if you talk about the effectiveness of a description or idea, you're probably, well, one, you're wasting your breath, and two, I think you're giving a not the most accurate answer, even for the question being asked. If you can kind of translate the intent of that question into secular speak, I don't think that it's the most on the nose answer you can give. There are a lot of things that work. How do you want to dispatch that roach over there? You can just take your hand and smash it, get a newspaper. You can try to trap it. But does that show you anything about the foundation of getting rid of roaches? Well, it doesn't. Not really. You've moved on to something like a method, and the Christian is not really concerned about methodology. So it's just a kind of a way of cross-talking. But yes, logic is functional. Things that are functional are things that we tend to appreciate and we do again, and other people tend to emulate. It's not that we don't try non-functional things. As humans, we've been trying things that don't work for 200,000 years. It's the process of finding 10,000 things that don't work. That's still a part of the invention process. So logic hasn't always been a language that we've used to describe things. When we did find this language, create this language to describe things, great, but that doesn't answer the question of why it works. We're just kind of saying it works, and it's a slightly different conversation.
So
Okay.
it doesn't. I don't get I still don't understand why that was such a big deal.
See, this does not actually explain how logic exists. Yes, sure, it works. I know that. We all get that. None of us disagree on that. But that doesn't explain how it works. That's like saying, hey, how does this basketball exist? Oh, because it works. No, it exists because it was created in a factory, right? So this...
And, you could, in fact, do the same thing with basketballs, in case you think that he's using a bad analogy like I did the first time I listened to this. But in a way, basketballs exist because they work. And a secularist could make that connection because we've tried other things. Before they landed on basketballs, they probably tried paper. What if we take a big enough sheet of paper and ball it up? We could throw it toward a hoop, right? I mean, that wouldn't work. Well, how about this square thing? Let's try that. Nope, that doesn't work. What if we make it out of lead? Oh, that doesn't bounce. I like a bouncy ball, so that doesn't work. I like to be able to pass this ball, so maybe the exploding ball is a bad idea because anyone who catches it blows up, so that doesn't work. So in some regards, the basketball exists because it works. Okay, again, not exactly the question being asked.
Explanation here simply just falls short, right? Let's move on. The next refutation you might hear is logic exists because man created it. But this is also just not true. Actually, what logic is they are universal consistent patterns, right? So these are universal consistent patterns. They are not man-made. If they were man-made, then each culture could just make their own laws of logic, and then debate would actually not even be possible because they would just all be right according to their own standard.
Which is exactly how societies used to be. Heck, we had different ways of doing numbers. You remember the time before we had the number zero? It kind of makes math tricky without a zero, right? So we do have to refine them. These are languages. It's not like we weren't trying to describe reality accurately, but we hadn't identified all the tools to do that. So we get the tools together, we make them operate in a certain way. Boom, mathematics as a language. We did invent maths in that we invented all language. But we didn't invent the things that we're describing. And so in the same way, no, we didn't invent logic, but we did invent a way of talking about the things that were accurate descriptions of reality. Because we used to try logic without good descriptions of reality, and things didn't work. And different societies would have this different, well, everybody knows this is just logical. And so they couldn't actually share information and join forces to do things or even have good conversations. That's a human thing. Now, why is that the case? Because we hadn't fully identified the true things about identity in nature, and we certainly didn't have a good language to talk about them. But at some point we did. At some point we did develop that. So don't lean too heavily on the idea that humans didn't invent logic. We invented logic in that we recognized these, let's call them patterns or descriptions. We invented ways of talking about them that everyone could use uniformly. It's just language. Okay? Also, language, not a metaphysical reality. There was something else I wanted to add to that when I got to this point, but I don't remember what it was, so let's go.
Critique, right? So, yeah, this doesn't actually make sense or explain it at all, because in that case, every person would be right and you could just come up with the laws of logic. No, instead, logic is not created. It is instead discovered, right? So we don't create logic, we discover it. And so these are consistent universal patterns that the atheist must justify. Why do these consistent universal...
No, we don't. So I agree with you as you're talking about logic. We didn't create logic, we discovered it. We didn't create one thing next to another thing being two things. All right, we discovered it. We learned how to talk about it. So I'm gonna go ahead and grant all that. But what you're really saying is that you're making a more generic statement that you don't have a syllogism for, which is everything is God. That's really what you're saying, and that's why I say no matter how much you drill down with scientific explanations for things, they're always going to regress to one more thing. But what's the foundation that underpins that? And the answer always has to be God. So it's really everything is God. If this pre-existing truth, was here before us, then someone had to make it true, and that is simply not true. Logic makes sense in a universe where there are things with relationships to each other that can be described by other people. Take away all that and you don't have logic. It doesn't exist as a metaphysical object outside of human minds, right? Because there's no one to describe anything. That's not to say that, theoretically, if you have this watcher out there, then that watcher, couldn't then describe things. They would, and they would use reality to describe reality. They would come up with a language to describe it, and we would call it logic. But that's just the necessary entailment of a thing actually existing. And what exists is not metaphysical things. What exists is reality. And then it just takes a mind to then describe reality. Without the minds, the descriptions don't matter. They don't exist. Take away all the minds, and the idea of two being two doesn't exist anywhere in the universe. There's no math. There are no minds. There's no one to describe it. So it's just a description. But if you're saying, well, that description still kind of, if there was a mind, they would still have to discover it. Well, yes, but it's because you have real things that can be described. Okay.
Patterns exist. How do these consistent universal patterns exist? And that's something really important to keep in mind.
Because they're things. I'm looking at things on my desk right now, and there are patterns that make up those things. All right, that's just reality, though. And this is, I can't overemphasize this enough, and some of you think I already overemphasized it enough. All of these arguments can just come down to reality, and then the question, well, where did reality come from? That's all tag is. So it's a misidentification of a thing that is not actually a thing. And it's just saying, because it is a thing, it's got to be God. Because he's the only answer, the only explanation for anything that is a thing.
When you are using tag, those are the two most important questions, in my opinion, that you could answer. Why and how. Maybe not two most important questions, but two most important words that you can kind of spam, right?
Right, you can spam them. Why, how? Because, like a kid, no matter what answer you can get, you can always ask another why, how. You just ask that until the answers are exhausted, and then you can say, therefore God.
Why, how? Because what you're going to notice is some atheists kind of say things but don't really get to the bottom of it. You know what I mean? And what we're trying to do with tag is actually dig all the way down to the atheist presuppositions. I like to make this analogy. Your worldview is like a house, right? Your presuppositions are the foundation of your house. If you cannot justify those presuppositions, then your whole house falls down, right? So yeah, let's go on to another refutation. Another refutation that you might hear is simply the laws of logic do not exist. That is actually something I've heard before, is somebody just straight up say that logic doesn't exist. But yes, it does, right? Again, logic are universal consistent patterns. Patterns do exist, right? So these are immaterial laws that exist. And what you'll notice with the atheists is that they will try to kick out the lawgiver, but keep the law. They'll try to kick out God, but keep the law of logic, right? So God is the lawgiver, but they just try to remove him and still try to justify logic, which is exactly why their position is absurd, because you can't justify the law without the lawgiver. It doesn't make sense, right? So no, the laws of logic definitely do exist, right? And of course there are, because if they didn't exist, then we would just be living according to some, we would be living in some sort of complex world, right? Where somehow the law of non-contradiction would be true and these things would be true. So, and then you would also have to define, you would also have to ask the atheist who says this, well, what do you mean by exist, right? How do you define existence? Because if they only define existence by physical existence, well, then you could dive into that and ask them why, dig to the presuppositions of why that is the case. And
right. So there goes my pedantic number two problem with it. It keeps showing its head. Maybe it's not as pedantic as I thought it was. What do you mean by exist? He's so close. He just needs to think another thought that his absolute certainty will not allow him to think. He thinks the problem is that the atheist doesn't have a good definition of exist. He's never considered the possibility that the Christian is the one who doesn't have a good definition of exist.
Why they don't see immaterial things as existing things. So yeah, ask them those questions, try to dig down to the bottom of that. And then to add on to that, what you want to ask to this atheist that denies the existence of logic is say, well, if only material things exist, how do we account for non-material, right? So immaterial, universal, consistent, unchanging patterns. If only matter exists, how do we account for the laws of logic? Now, there are more arguments that the atheist will try to use, more refutations that the atheist will try to combat you with. Those, I'll leave you to do your own research on those. This is a quick video on tag, right? Tag is pretty, I want to say pretty complex, right? It's one of the more big brain type of arguments for God, right? This is not like something simpler like the Kalam cosmological argument. This is the transcendental argument.
Okay, so I believe that tag is fairly complex. It'd be interesting if an actual philosopher talks about it in a way that is accessible. But I would argue that the reason tag is complex is because of all of the things that I've pointed out where they're using language to mean things that their interlocutor does not. And so with tag, there is so much talking past each other. Transcendental, what do you mean by that? Never gets defined, so we're talking past each other there. Exists, what do you mean by exist? There is a lot of conversation that can be had there. Metaphysical realities, what do you mean by metaphysical? Ideas, descriptions, these things have to exist and therefore require somebody or something to make them exist in a metaphysical sense. So talking about brain functions and things like that will never amount to anything because that's not what they're talking about. So I think these are some of the reasons why tag is so hard to get your head around. And whenever you see debates with people on tag, they never end satisfactory because at the end of the debate, they're no closer to speaking the same language as they are at the beginning of the debate.
Right, so this might take you weeks to actually get. This is just a quick overview of it, right? Kind of an introduction to it. So yeah, let's keep going. So next I'm going to be telling you guys, and this is the last thing before I end the video. Again, a very quick video on tag. I've also done a live stream on tag, and I probably will talk about it more in the future, of course. But this is how you argue with tag. You want to first assume the unbeliever's worldview, right? You want to assume their worldview. And then what you want to do is perform a reductio ad absurdum, right? Reducing their presuppositions, their worldview to an absurd, right? Showing them that they simply cannot justify logic in their worldview. Then what you want to do is in the Christian worldview, then you want to ask the atheist to assume your worldview. You actually show that you cannot reduce the Christian worldview to an absurd, right? So
what are you talking about? I did that within like the first 5 or 10 minutes of this podcast. It's just by replacing God is the necessary foundation for logic with something else as the necessary foundation of logic. Asserting that logic exists and therefore proving that the something else exists. That is about as absurd as we can break it down.
You can reduce the atheist worldview to absurd, but then after assuming their beliefs and their worldview and then reducing it to an absurd, you want to then ask them to assume your worldview, try to reduce it to an absurd, and then when it doesn't work, it shows that your worldview is actually more coherent. Now you might be asking, Caden, as a Christian, how do you think that logic exists? Now, I actually learned the transcendental argument, or not necessarily learned, I did learn some of it, but I was introduced to it by Jay Dyer, right? And Jay Dyer says that God created the laws of logic. I actually disagree here. I would say that the laws of logic are ultimately grounded in who God is. They're grounded in...
Okay, I'm sorry to stop. I'll just rewind it a little bit so I can finish this thought. It's a worthy enough thought, but I just wanted to point out that this is exactly the same as Euthyphro's dilemma, only instead of for morality, for logic. Right? So you'll recognize that. Does logic exist? Because because it exists and God gives us the rules of logic correctly, or does God invent the rules of logic and then gives it to us? He's clearly picked one of the horns. Well, okay, not really. He's picked the same kind of third horn that modern Christians pick with the moral question. He says, no. It's not that God is picking. It's because it is God's nature. So same thing. Morality is simply an aspect of God's nature. Logic is simply a part of God's nature. So I'm I'm stumbling a little bit because I'm trying not to relitigate that whole thing. So I'll let it stand right there. I just wanted to point out the similarities and the same faulty thinking about that.
His very essence and his very nature, which explains to it by Jay Dyer, right? And Jay Dyer says that God created the laws of logic. I actually disagree here. I would say that the laws of logic are ultimately grounded in who God is. They're grounded in his very essence and his very nature, which explains why they're universal, consistent, and unchanging, right? And that also explains why God can't create a square circle. That explains why God can't do something illogical, because it is ultimately grounded in who he is. Yeah. Thank you guys for watching this video. I love y'all. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like and subscribe button. Again, there's a lot more diving in you could do. I think that for one of the refutations that the atheists try to give, which is like, logic just simply doesn't exist. I didn't really do a great job explaining why that position is wrong. But yeah, again, this is just a kind of introductory video to the transcendental argument. But definitely dive into it. But yeah, thank you guys for watching this video, and that's something to chew on.
Okay. So thank you, Caden. Again, I like Caden here. I like his presentation. I think it's probably the least offensive of the presentations, but it still carries all of the arrogance that Tag does. Although there are one or two places where he seemed to be a little bit self-aware, and Caden is someone that I wouldn't mind having a discussion with, which is very unusual for me because there's nobody who runs Tag that I would normally say, yeah, I'd really like to talk to that guy. So you stand in rarefied air, Caden, good job. Unfortunately, it does not move the needle. It doesn't move the needle for me. It doesn't keep Tag from being just a terribly bad argument. It's not an argument at all for me. It seems like a half an argument. It's more of a claim. You could get rid of premise 2 and get rid of the conclusion, and you would still have all of Tag. Right? That's a problem. So if you just have premise 1, God is the necessary precondition for logic, and just stop. That's all of Tag. It's all in there. And so Tag doesn't even try to make an argument for that. So it's just a malformed, syllogistic style argument. It gets an F. Because it's not a full argument. It's kind of leaves you like a half a sentence, and you're waiting for someone to complete the sentence. Or like a person who gives a punchline and never gives the joke. So it's, on points, Tag is just at the bottom. But what about what about its merits? I mean, if you can still man tag to the best of your ability, is there any merit to the idea that because we can think about reality in a consistent way that makes sense and help us survive, that means God? Yeah, again, I think actually we're still at premise one here. How do you get to the conclusion that because reality works and you can describe it, therefore God? Because it seems to me that you could have a completely non-God reality, and it might even work a little chaotically, but you could still accurately describe it, and you'd be doing so without a God. And so that would just be the logic of the non-God world. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm spending some extra time on this one. Obviously, we're going to talk about this in the wrap-up show, but I'm trying to get past my prejudices about tag to try to find some merits in it. And I've got to tell you, of the time that I've been dealing with tag, I have found no merit to zero merit. There's nothing that I could grant tag that would help it be a better argument than what it is. All right. But that's my opinion. What's yours? Skepticsandseekers.squarespace.com. Log into your Discuss account, discuss away. Send me an email, skepticsandseekers.squarespace.com. Until next time, I will see you in the comments. And in the meantime, I'm out.